Tension swatch help. The first thing you need to look at is your pattern and see what the pattern calls for needle size and the tension. So my mysterious mythical pattern here, right on the pattern, it tells me that it wants a 5mm or US or whatever you're more comfortable in using. I prefer using the millimeter. So the calls for a 5mm needle size, and right on the pattern it says in the gauge that it is 18 stitches per 4 inches, and it says it's 24 rows per 4 inches. It'll tell you what those numbers are right on the pattern. So whatever pattern you're doing, write down the needle size and write down the stitches and the rows that it states. Then I need you to take this a step further. What does this mean per inch? So it's just simple math. So this means that 18 stitches that they stipulate, and you're going to divide that by 4, and that equals, you can use your calculator, and that equals 4.5 stitches per inch. That's what this sweater or whatever it is you're knitting is going to measure out. You'll knit 4.5 stitches and you will have an inch of knitting. It also says the gauge or the tension should be 24 rows per 4 inches. So this means that 24 rows divided by 4 is equal to 6 rows per inch. That is what your knitting should be. What I would recommend is, if the pattern's calling for a 5mm needle size, you start your first tension swatch with that size, which is what I did. I knit my tension swatch and I knit it with a size 5mm needle, and there it is right there. And when I knit that, then I counted the number of stitches per the number of inches. How you do that, you just take your, I do 30 stitches because it gives you a good length to work from. And you just get a ruler or a measuring tape, and if you've got enough knitting to make 4 inches, terrific. You then count the number of stitches per those 4 inches, and I like to usually start a couple of rows in, or stitches in, and I just grab a sharp object, sharp needle, and I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and I just count right up to the 4-inch mark to see how many stitches there are per the 4 inches. In this particular case, that ended up being 16. Now going this way, I don't have 4 inches of knitting, and that's okay as long as you have at least 2 inches per row. I mean, ideally as a new knitter you should probably go for 4, because the more rows you knit, the more accurate your count is going to be and the more your tension adjusts. But there's up to a 2-inch mark, so I would just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would just count how many rows are in that 2-inch space. So I did 3 different swatches for you, and I want to show you what each of them looked like. There's one swatch, 30 stitches, there's another swatch, 30 stitches, and there's a third swatch in 30 stitches. You can see how they're all different sizes. I'll show you how this will work. Now, so my 5mm, which I knit, then I counted, and it was 16 stitches per 4 inches. So you're going to take this number, your stitch number, which is 16, and you're going to divide it by your inches, which I did 4 inches, where I counted that. So 16 divided by 4 is equal to 4 stitches per inch. Go ahead and use a calculator if you need to. Then I measured the number of rows. Well, I didn't have 4 inches of material. I actually counted per 2 inches, right? And there were actually 11 rows per 2 inches. So I would take that row number, 11, and I would divide it by my inches, which in this case it was 2, and that equals 5.5 rows per inch. Now you can compare what your knitting is measuring against what the pattern is telling you that you should be knitting. And if they're close, terrific, away you go and start knitting. If they're not close, or you think you could possibly do better, then you should maybe try adjusting a needle size up or down, depending on what's going on. Now in this particular case, it's just because I know my particular knitting style. I am a rather loose knitter, which means that my stitches per inch are less than what a pattern requires. So what I'm going to do, because I need more stitches per inch, I'm going to drop down a needle size, which I did. I used a 4mm, which happened to be this particular swatch. And when I measured that swatch, I did have 4 inches across to measure. So I had 4 inches across, and when I did that, I discovered I had 19 stitches per 4 inches. So I take that number 19, I divide it by my inches. I had 4, and that, using my calculator, came to 4.75 stitches per inch. And then I measured my rows. Now I didn't have 4 inches to measure, I had 2 inches that I decided to measure, and in that 2 inches I had 13 rows. So I take my row number, which was 13, and I divide it by my inches, which was 2, and using the calculator, that comes to 6.5 rows per inch. Now that is very close. 4.75 stitches per inch versus the original pattern of 4.5. That is pretty bang on, and this is probably the needle size I'm going to end up using. 6.5 rows per inch versus 6 rows per inch. So what this means is my knitting is it will end up a little bit longer than what they're doing, but generally this is easy to adjust on most knitting. It's the stitches per inch that's of concern, not the length, because the length I can just sort of measure as I go, and if I'm knitting away and discovering, because generally a pattern will say knit until the work is so many inches long, so you're not really worrying about the number of rows, but you do want this to be fairly close. So this is more than likely, or sorry, not more than likely, this is the needle size that I would use. Now for interest's sake, I knit a size higher so you could see what would happen, which ended up being this piece, and that was a 6mm. And when I measured that one in 4 inches, because I have 4 inches there to measure, I counted and I had 15 stitches per 4 inches. So I take that number 15 and I divide it by 4, and that equals 3.75. And the rows, again, I don't have 4 inches, but I could measure 2 inches, and I had 10 rows. So I take my number 10 divided by my inch number 2, and that is 5 rows per inch. So in the pattern you want 4.5 stitches per inch. That's 3.75. That's not good. That needle size is far too big. So for me, I will end up using 4mm needle size, and that is the Tension Swatch Help.